Samurai warfare is fascinating for many unique details that we have already touched on in many other videos. But one aspect I have not delved into too greatly yet has been that of one of its most significant elements: foot soldiers. The concept of soldiers on foot can be a bit confusing at points when it comes to their history in pre-modern Japan, and this is because of the elephant in the room: the samurai. In earlier times, the samurai were predominantly seen to have been mounted warriors, but that is a bit misleading because, of course, there would come to be samurai of lower status who did operate on foot. But as many of you may be already well aware, there happened to be a very significant shift that occurred over time, as soon the majority of ground warfare within Japan would be dominated not by samurai, but in fact by large groups of armed peasants. It is this group that we will be focusing on here in this video, as it was they who would become the core idea of what foot soldiers were at the height of samurai warfare. Not samurai, but peasant foot soldiers known as Ashigaru. Now, this topic of the diverse role of peasants or lower-class people in pre-modern Japan is one that is once again being covered through several different fantastic videos between myself, Samurai and Ninja History, and Sengoku Studies. We are all going to be discussing topics regarding the peasantry or lower classes in Old Japan this month, so check out the links in the description if you would like to learn more about this interesting subject. But in terms of the Ashigaru, where is the best place to begin? This can prove to be a bit difficult, because the concept of common foot soldiers similar to our idea of the Ashigaru actually existed prior to when the term Ashigaru started to appear. To be honest, I think the perfect place to start would actually be before the rise of the samurai, going back all the way to the 7th century, when Emperor Tenmu brought forth the call for a grand national army. This force was to be comprised of conscripted able-bodied males from the lower classes, and what's more than that was that they were also to supply all of their own weapons and armor themselves. Nothing was really to be given to them by the government which they were serving. They were led by provincial commanders who were selected out of the ruling aristocracy, which of course meant that military leaders rarely had any real strategic skill. These issues facing this national army of conscripts became the most evident during the wars against the Emishi people of northern Japan, who in the following centuries proved to be the most significant threat to the Yamato. These poorly drilled, poorly equipped, and poorly led peasants were no match against determined warriors who had begun raiding south. One group that did prove effective, however, was that of mounted warriors throughout the Kanto Plain, who excelled in armed conflict against these northerners. This, as we know, would in time lead to the eventual rise of the samurai class, as the national army was in time disbanded in favor of these superior fighters. Of course, peasant soldiers did not disappear entirely, as peasant levies would from time to time still be called upon in various situations, yet they remained hastily recruited and mostly of poor quality. What is significant is that the idea of what would later transform into the Ashigaru is thought to have arisen here during the Heian period, as lower-class attendants were integrated into various military roles, taking part in a wide range of miscellaneous duties and perhaps even serving as reserve troops. Yet they were obviously seen to not be any level near the professionalism of the samurai who themselves were coming to dominate the country and would inevitably come to clash in the legendary Genpei War, which sealed their place atop Japan with the subsequent establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate. Something important about this all, though, is really the usage of the idea of using common people as soldiers during the Genpei War, and how it all gets a bit confusing, in large part thanks to terminology that does not translate quite well to English. It would be Minamoto no Yoritomo, the ultimate victor of the Genpei War and the first Kamakura shogun, who would establish the status of the Gokenin, provincial soldiers who supported him. The Gokenin were made up of what were known as hyakusho, which sometimes gets compared to being simply that of a peasant. However, hyakusho is a bit of a gray term that carries with it potentially a few more lower-class statuses, and may even have been subject to hereditary rights. This makes it hard for us then to really compare the Gokenin to truly being peasant foot soldiers. Still, this was an important shift, as lower-class soldiers began to become more and more common within samurai armies. For real peasant foot soldiers, however, in centuries to come, gradual changes within the methods of samurai warfare would in time lead to their real rise. The first large initial sign of coming change occurred through the Mongol invasions of Japan, where samurai armies were tested like never before. It is believed that peasant foot soldiers were actually brought up here to help combat the incoming tide of the Mongol forces, fighting alongside their samurai overlords. But their involvement here does not appear to have been anything too massive or at least widely remembered. Rather, a clearer indication of their appearance would not come until half a century later, as we move into the Nanboku-cho period. This age of chaos between two rival competing imperial courts can be viewed as one of the most significant eras for the shifting face of war in Japan, as battles across the country began to reshape the trends of samurai warfare itself. It is believed that it was during this time that the actual usage of the term Ashigaru first appeared. Now, there seem to be several reasons for the increased usage of peasant foot soldiers, so let us first start off by discussing the trends of warfare. Throughout the Nanboku-cho period, two significant forms of fighting began to take an increased role, these being the rise of skirmish troops on foot armed with bows, and troops on foot armed with spears or pikes to counter the charges of samurai cavalry. These two elements may have been similar to some degree by which the Mongols had actually fought the samurai as well, so there is a solid argument to be made here for how much the wars against the Mongols would have influenced these developments. But what I think to be the most significant factor to the actual rise of common foot soldiers bleeds more into the coming years of the Onin War and the eventual Sengoku period, what would become the real height of samurai warfare as I described it earlier. It was throughout this time that samurai lords had become increasingly autonomous and therefore self-reliant. So in order to raise larger armies for their continuous wars, they would need to draw upon the manpower of the people they ruled over. And what better way to use them than by handing them a spear or training them how to use a bow properly? Soon the ratio of samurai to peasant foot soldiers began to swing heavily in favor of the Ashigaru, as foot soldiers began to become the main body of all samurai armies. That's not to say that all Ashigaru were initially well equipped. Calling forth men from the countryside to fight would have been met with varying results, as they did not already always own their own weapons, let alone armor. So outfitting them might have proved a challenge for unprepared lords. This also might be the reason why they are even called Ashigaru, as the word itself literally translates to mean light foot, which could be an indicator of their light equipment. They were also, of course, not initially well disciplined either, as many took their service as merely an opportunity to loot and pillage. Yet, this was also a fabulous chance for Ashigaru to find themselves better weapons and armor off the backs of dead enemies. However, despite their initial struggles, the usefulness of these peasant foot soldiers was indeed greatly felt by their samurai leaders. And soon enough, as the years of war raged on, standardizations began to take place. Soon, clans would begin outfitting their Ashigaru with simple loaned sets of armor, and other identifiers that marked soldiers as belonging to the armies of specific families. This is really where Ashigaru began to resemble the image we all think of whenever we picture them in our heads. In time, serving as an Ashigaru increasingly became seen as a full profession in itself. As a side note, it is important to add that although many Ashigaru would join up through their own volition, there were still instances where common people would be conscripted for military service during times of need. Yet, getting back to the professionalism within the role which was starting to flourish, it begins to lead to another very interesting concept that has to do with social mobility. Many of you may be already familiar with this, but for those of you who are not, Ashigaru received compensation for their service from their overlords in similar ways to their samurai counterparts. If an Ashigaru performed well in battle, they were to be rewarded just like that of the samurai. For what better way was there to ensure the loyalty of soldiers other than to make sure that they were all recognized for their service and notable deeds? This obviously did lead to some friction between samurai and Ashigaru, particularly during awkward situations in battle, like who was really allowed to take the honor of engaging the enemy first. But overall, it was more important to win battles than to fall behind due to formalities. And for those Ashigaru who were seen as the most competent, skilled, or accomplished, they were to be acclaimed for their qualities. What this all leads to is the highest reward that Ashigaru were able to receive, being that of promotion, transcending the boundaries of the class hierarchy of Premodern Japan, and going from a person of lower status to all of a sudden a member of the ruling warrior class, an Ashigaru becoming a samurai. This happened to many notable warriors throughout the Sengoku period, yet with no greater example than that of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who, as we know, would be destined to become Japan's second great unifier. A man who would be born a member of the lower classes but would rise through the ranks to one day rule the entire country. And what is ironic is that it would also be Hideyoshi who would pass laws that abolished this very same upward mobility, a move that many have described as him closing the door on his way out. By the early 1590s, Hideyoshi had frozen the social order of Japan, not in any move of spite or greed, but rather to ensure continued stability and security as the age of war was coming to an end. This actually creates a further debate regarding the status of all current Ashigaru at that time, and whether or not they should really be considered as part of the warrior class at that point. This has led to some coming to define Ashigaru as being somewhat synonymous to the samurai. But this is a very complicated argument and one that I don't want to get into here. For the sake of this video, the Ashigaru and the samurai are two separate entities from two separate classes. Now, cutting off their upward mobility did not mean, however, that the quality of Ashigaru would drop or that they would have been unincentivized to perform military service, as by the end of the 16th century, the Ashigaru had developed into a determined and professional fighting force, yet now coming to be heavily outfitted with Western-style firearms. Ashigaru were still to be led by samurai unit commanders, who organized them into structured groups or subunits, and through this organization, standardization, further training, and of course, experience, Ashigaru had become likely just as efficient as the samurai themselves. Indeed, I'd be willing to wager that the Ashigaru who served at the Great Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600 were among some of the most battle-hardened and elite soldiers throughout the entire Sengoku era. Yet, with the coming peace of the Edo period, the role of the Ashigaru began to obviously decline, with perhaps their last major action being during the siege of Osaka. By this point now, many Ashigaru were said to have been released from service, with only a portion remaining to fulfill duties to samurai families. It is hard to know what this surplus of released Ashigaru would go on to do with their lives, as because social order had been frozen, it becomes complicated for military men to have reintegrated themselves into peasant roles. And although a good portion were able to reintegrate themselves, there were also many who did not. This creates a gray area once again, where many could sort of be judged as lower-ranking members of the warrior class. One source even states that many unemployed Ashigaru became ronin. What this tells us is that by the end of the Sengoku period, the line between Ashigaru and samurai had blurred. Once again, I am going to maintain that I usually consider them both to be completely separate, but I welcome anyone to debate this in the comments. It is a very fascinating subject for sure. But anyways, with the decreasing role of the Ashigaru into the Edo period, this brings the topic of this video to a nice finishing point. As we can see, the Ashigaru were a significant element of samurai history, born out of necessity and ebbing and flowing with the evolution of samurai warfare. These diverse peasant foot soldiers would eventually come to heavily influence the path of the country at war. Initially being a disorganized rabble, but later coming to be drilled into elite units, which would also cause the best of them to rise into samurai leadership. They were, for all intents and purposes, the real backbone of samurai warfare through its height during the Sengoku period. Once again, if you would like to learn more about the role of the lower classes of pre-modern Japan, I recommend checking out the other two great videos which are being made in collaboration with this one from channels Samurai and Ninja History and Sengoku Studies. Links in the description. And with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.